Hi, folks. Welcome to the Long Story Short. This is Anne Marie, your Chief of Staff, and I am so excited to have Bryan on the show today. He is an exceptional Chief of Staff with experience in spades. And so I just want to jump right in. Bryan, thank you for joining us. And tell my people, who are you? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Cool. My name is Bryan Baecker. I'm originally from Cleveland, Ohio. I now live in Seattle, Washington. My professional journey spans several sectors, which include the military, technology, retail, and consulting. That's underscored by roles that blend strategic leadership with operational expertise. Uh,
Awesome.
my academic background, if there are any fans in the audience from the Midwest, my undergraduate degree is from the University of Dayton, and I'm actually finishing up my MBA right now at Xavier. So love the Midwestern references, and when people reach out about their experiences being from the Midwest and then leaving from there.
That's awesome. That is awesome. Somebody who likes to learn. Well, as you know, my audience is aspiring and current chief of staffs, as well as executives who have these talented individuals in their purview. And so, what I would love to hear from you is, can you share with my audience two things that you think chief of staffs should be aware of so they can be successful? Either things that you've learned or things that you've observed and you're incorporating into your everyday work.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I talk to chiefs of staff of all types, as well as aspiring chief of staff through my work on the advisory board at the chief of staff roundtable. And one of the things that people tell me that they take away the most from these discussions is my sort of discussions about a concept called situational awareness, which in the military sort of means something a little bit differently, and I've adapted it to what I think that means for a chief of staff, and that's that. As a chief of staff, I have the situational awareness to know when to stand in front of, behind, or beside my principal. I think this
Yeah.
adaptability is crucial for providing the right support at the right time. Uh, it's almost impossible to train. For me, it does come a lot from my military background.
Mhm.
One of my favorite commanders once told me that every good leader needs to know when to be a good follower. I think that's true for a chief of staff as much as it is for the principal. And if you have a great relationship, then those two kinds of things can ebb and flow naturally. Sometimes it takes a bit to establish that with your principal, but if you're lucky enough to get there, I think it's a game changer for the relationship.
That's awesome. That reminds me of a conversation I just had with another gentleman who's a chief of staff that kind of hits on this point about there's some level of experience that's required to be an effective chief of staff. So you understand, like you said, how you're going to gauge whatever's going on in their world and how you can best either partner and support whatever's going on, or at least elevate messages that need to be elevated. And so I think that's what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah. Look, there's a lot of people who come to the chief of staff role from a lot of different
Yeah.
angles or vectors, right? Some people come from, executive administrative work. Some people come in from, group program management work. And so they tend to have a more, administrative or more operational background. And that's great. Like, depending on what your principal is looking for, depending on the job description you go into, depending on their ability to let you learn on the job. But my experience is in high level, chief of staff work at some of these big enterprise tech companies. And there really isn't a space to learn on the job at that level. These principals are expecting you to come in and know exactly what to do to really act as a force multiplier to get their teams,
Mhm.
achieving more by doing less. And so what I really try to do when I talk to an aspiring chief of staff is understand where they are, right? There are tons of opportunities to become a chief of staff at small, medium-sized businesses, even in the C-suite where some of those sort of stakes might not be as high, or there might be more opportunities to learn kind of as you go. And a lot of principals are also still getting familiar with the chief of staff role in the business space. And so for them to kind of learn and understand what the role can really do, I think is also important.
That's awesome. What's something else that you think would be critical for chief of staff to help them be successful?
Yeah. So when you sort of gave me those questions ahead of time, I tried to think of something like at like kind of high, like meta level, and then I try to think of something really tactical. So we could go,
Yeah.
sort of go between the two. So the tactical thing, I think that every chief of staff needs to be successful. The most important thing is how to build and maintain an effective rhythm of the business.
Mm.
Super apropos given your recent LinkedIn article on the topic. I've actually been writing a similar article from a slightly different perspective, but I loved reading yours. It actually helped refine sort of my approach and my thinking on it. So for me, an effective rhythm of the business consists of two parts. The first one is what most people think of, right? It's the weekly operational planning rhythm, and it ensures day-to-day tasks align with immediate goals. Nothing slips through the cracks. The team's, focused on, what's right in front of them. And then as other things sort of come up, we typically call them fire drills. They can be addressed, and things in the immediate vicinity can be reprioritized accordingly. But the thing that most chiefs of staff, in my experience, sort of struggle with, and most principals as well, is that quarterly strategic planning and reporting rhythm, right? It focuses on the long-term objectives and progress. And I think if you do it right, a lot of other things just sort of fall in line, right?
Yeah.
A lot of things, sit down. I mean, how many times have you seen a team sit down and try to think, oh, what are we going to present for our all team meeting? And then every month that they do that, or every quarter that they do that, they're starting from a blank sheet of paper
Yep.
each time, right? I think if you have an effective planning rhythm, those at least at the quarterly level, quarterly sort of period, that those kinds of things just shake themselves out, right? You're coming in, you're saying, okay, at the end of a year, hey, this is where we ended this year. For the next year, we're going to be doing these three strategic directives. This is how all of our work is going to, roll up to those strategic directives, and it enables people in the organization to answer two fundamental questions that are really key to, people being highly engaged and having great morale, which is, are we focused on the right work, and is the work that I'm doing laddering up to the broader organization or the broader company's success? Simplicity and accountability are so key in these ways, these sort of clear mechanisms for capturing all this data, distilling it down, facilitating a strategic planning sort of offsite that leads to a good strategic plan, and then reporting on it throughout the year is so important. And I think there's so many people that just, I don't know why, like maybe they don't have a reference frame for it. They've never seen it done well. But when you do that, it's kind of like every quarter is like rinse and repeat, just like
Yeah.
every week becomes rinse and repeat. And it's kind of analogous to, like, Steve Jobs wearing the same outfit every day, right?
Hmm.
You take away the decision fatigue around those processes, and you just give people that dependable
Yeah.
sort of rhythm to sort of align to, and then they can use all their creative brain power for solving the problems that the organization's facing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm excited for your article. So for you to post it. And let me tell you why I was excited with what you were just saying is that with my current executive that I'm working with right now, we are literally revamping our ROB. And that was one of the things that we were looking at is, how do we look at this from the holistic, the 50,000 point view? So we distill it down. And the point that you raised that I'm hoping that people didn't miss is, once you've got that set, there's little room for questions at that point, because you just know from the annual perspective, this is what you're hitting. On a quarterly perspective, from the quarterly perspective, this is what's happening on a monthly cadence. And on the monthly cadence, you can almost determine what needs to happen on a weekly basis. And it takes that rigor out of what's coming up to, oh, this is what happened last quarter. Let's talk about what happened last quarter, this quarter, because this is where we want to get to next quarter. And it's a rhythm, and it makes it easy. I love simplicity, and I love that that's what you brought up, is the simplicity factor, because being a chief of staff is not simple.
No,
It's
no.
full of chaos.
Yeah, and when you have an organization that might have 2,500 people in it, right?
Yeah.
And everybody's trying to figure out, what is happening, when it's happening, why it's happening, right? I think a lot of people forget that the object of communication is, or the objective of communication is to be understood.
Yes.
And so they put all this information out, and they assume just because it's out that people understand it and people are moving in the right direction. And so the more that you can simplify it, the more that you can be
Yeah.
transparent about the things that you're doing, why you're doing them, and the more you can keep reiterating them again in that same sort of rhythm, people will start to know where to go to find information. They'll start to self-serve, they'll start to communicate, and they'll start to share the messages organically. And more importantly, when you're doing it in that manner, it's actually a forcing function for the rest of your organization to question work that falls outside of those strategic directives, right? I mean, how many times do we get distracted by a million shiny baubles, and or you see an organization that says, oh, we have 45 strategic directives we're going to deliver this year. Oh, really? Are you? I've never seen anybody deliver more than 3 to 5 in 1 year, right? If everything's important, nothing's important.
It's important.
And so for the team to be able to say, hey, you communicated these three strategic directives, someone's asking me to do this work.
Mm-hmm.
Ideally, they feel empowered to say, we shouldn't do this because it doesn't align to our strategic directives. But if not, at least you give them the mechanism to push back and say, hey, I need to go to our senior leadership, whether it's at the org level or even at the C-suite level. I need to go to them and say, what do you want me to stop doing to deliver this work, right? And I think once you start talking in those mechanisms, the sort of distractions and the noise and the chaos tends to quiet down, at least in my experience.
Yeah. Well, and it adds a level of clarity to what's going on. I love to call those squirrel moments. And I'll be in meetings with some of my peers and we'll be like, oh, there's a squirrel moment.
Yeah, love that.
There's a squirrel moment. Let's see if we can bring it back. And so that's exactly what you're talking about. It kind of condenses the confusion to a very limited set where you can almost erase it because you know exactly what's expected. You've heard the message. There is transparency. And then the last point that you brought up, the ability to empower your employees to say, I have a question. I don't understand. Maybe I'm missing it, but this is what has been communicated to me. Help clarify where I need to make sure that this fits in. And if it doesn't, okay, well, we're having a squirrel moment as long as we all understand that's what's happening and we're kind of deviating from the plan. So love that. So on a different note, can you think of a moment where like either you experienced a gotcha or somebody who you were observing, they experienced a gotcha as a chief of staff and you went, yep, I'm not going to do that during your tenure?
Yeah. I mean, I think it stems back to kind of something I mentioned earlier, which is, how important the relationship with your principal is.
Yeah.
If you aren't on the same page, I mean, it's an understatement to say it can lead to significant challenges. I think, I've seen some really good examples. I mean, we both had a chance to attend, COS 24 at Microsoft, and we got to hear Deb Cupp and Jeff Buckeye talk about their relationship. I mean, that was really special.
Yep.
Not everyone gets to that. I mean, even before they ever worked together, they had both been, you guys call yourself softies, right?
Yes.
Right. They had been softies for 20 years, and the mutual respect from their respective sort of careers inside the organization, I think, let them start at a level of trust that I think a lot of chiefs of staff can sort of only aspire to. But I think like now when I think of like the North Star of like what that relationship looks like, I think back to watching them on stage, and I'm a very visual learner, so that like, keeping that in mind. But I think of a time where I, like you said, you called it a gotcha. For me, it was around change management support, right?
Mm.
It doesn't matter how effective you are as a chief of staff in terms of like, maybe not effective is the right word. That does matter. It doesn't matter how skilled you are as a chief of staff.
Mm-hmm.
You can't execute on an island, right? So the team needs to hear your principal publicly supporting and following the new initiatives that you as a chief of staff are being asked to put into practice, right? Again, even if you're super, super skilled and you create the best rhythm of the business, for example, if your principal isn't following it, or isn't sort of advocating with their direct reports, like chief of staff, the ability to lead by influencing, there's probably no other position where you have to lead by influencing more than a high level, C-suite chief of staff, because all of the big egos on the team don't report to you. You don't have a certain rank on your shoulder, like in the military, where people just have to listen to you when you say them. You have to get people to do something different, which is hard in any context. You have to get somebody to do something different. And if you don't have that change management support from your principal, you're going to fail. I I've never seen it happen any other way, and it's happened to me. And once I realized I didn't have it, then I just had a conversation with my principal that said, look, this is a boundary for me.
Oh,
You can choose how you want to proceed. You can either support me and back me up on this, or our relationship isn't going to work. Right.
yeah.
And I think that's really important. Like, I mean, don't get me wrong. I realize like what a position of privilege that is for me to be in at this point in my career. But I'm at a point where like, look, I know what my skill set is. I know what's required for me to be successful. If I'm being set up for failure, I'm out. Like, I'll go
Yes.
find a place where I can be successful and where people want to support me in the way that I support them.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's such an important point that you bring up because it shouldn't be underrated because it's probably one of the most important relationships you have as a chief of staff because you're literally so in the trenches. They are sharing with you confidential information that they may not share with their peers that sit with them. That the only other person that knows that information might be HR or CELA. Like that relationship is so critical. And when you realize that there's a break in that relationship, there is a level of failure for the principal also, as well as the chief of staff, because now it's not a typical manager-employee relationship. Like it's super, super crucial. And so, like, I appreciate that you said if this doesn't work, I need to do something different where I can be successful because that's the bottom line. That literally is for this role. If you're not successful with your principal, you need to think about something different where you can be because that can tank your career
Oh,
completely.
absolutely. Like literally, I couldn't think of anything more important to get right. As if you got one thing right, right? If your chief of staff principal relationship is broken, you're going to fail. And if your chief of staff doesn't implicitly trust you, like there's a concept in the military called commander's intent, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically when you get an order from a higher echelon of command, you have to completely redisseminate that op order, right? You have to write it for your unit. The only thing that doesn't change is the commander's intent. And so what that essentially means is that you are an autonomous extension of your leader or your principal's intent, right? You have the autonomy as long as you're operating within the constraints of the Army values, and in a business that's the company's values, whatever that is.
Mm-hmm.
You have the autonomy to execute that, right? And if your principal doesn't trust that you can execute their intent on their behalf and know when you've kind of gotten to the limit of that command authority they've extended to you and come back and say, hey, this is the situation, this is what I recommend doing, what do you think? And they're like, yeah, go do it, or no, go do this instead. Like if you don't have that sort of relationship, and don't get me wrong, like a lot of education needs to happen in the business world for chiefs of staff because there are still a ton of people, even at the highest levels of some of these organizations. Microsoft is an exception because you guys have had that role for so long. People generally get it. Whereas a lot of organizations I consult with, the principals are like, I'm thinking about hiring a chief of staff. What does that look like? Right. So there's principals that don't know what a chief of staff can do for them. And so they conflate, EA responsibilities or group program management responsibilities. But if they hire a real senior leader there who can act as an executive sounding board, it makes whether it's their C-suite or their leadership suite a lot less lonely, right? Colin Powell used to talk about how lonely it is at the top. And when you don't have a sounding board that you can go to and ask questions and they're going to tell you what you want to hear, or sorry, what you need to hear, not what you want to hear. Like
Right.
if you're chief of staff at that level and a principal operating at that level, it is a beautiful thing.
You have been amazing for these last few minutes. You need to look at all his content because it is so on point. I totally appreciated just having you here for these last few minutes. I want to leave you with any parting words that you want to leave my audience before we sign off.
Yeah, well, first of all, just thank you for having me. I mean, I love listening to other people and hearing diverse perspectives. So, you are always so good at doing that and getting that out of whatever room you're in. So, just yeah, thank you for this opportunity. It was great. Um, I mentioned before, like I said, I talked to a lot of chiefs of staff and organizations looking to hire chiefs of staff. So they always ask, what makes a good chief of staff? And unfortunately, I give the typical consultant answer, which is it depends.
Yeah.
Um, and I sort of said this a little bit before. Every role is different, but the most common denominator I found is that breadth and diversity of experience are tremendously valuable, right?
Yeah.
How are you going to be a strategic partner, sounding board, tactical empathizer, and leader without a broad set of diverse experiences to draw from, right? Um, and the thing that I want to give a lot of people who are thinking about becoming a chief of staff to think about is that domain experience isn't a requirement. And actually, to be honest, I want to challenge a lot of principles on this as well. Domain experience isn't a requirement. It's the easiest thing to teach and train. If you get a competent person, you can teach them your space, but you can't make them a good chief of staff if
Mhm.
they're not. So domain expertise, really deep domain expertise, don't get me wrong, in some roles is necessary, but by all measures, in most roles, it needn't be a disqualifier, right? Um, you know, you're the right chief of staff for the right principal, but settling for the wrong one is not going to serve either of you well, right? I think that's the one thing that I would give people to sort of take away that last bit. If you're not the right chief of staff for someone, you are for someone else. And so just keep that in mind as you're sort of looking at the landscape and not getting discouraged. You're like, oh, I think I would be great for this one role. Like there's a ton of roles you can be perfect for. Or if you get some feedback that was like, oh, well, we're actually looking for someone with a little more of this experience. Like that's fine.
Right.
Rejection is redirection.
Yep. Awesome. Thanks again, Bryan. Everyone, like I said, if you're not following Bryan, you need to start right now, today, after you finish watching this, because I promise you the content that he's putting out there is going to help you, regardless of if you're trying to be chief of staff or not. His perspective and the way that he thinks is very intuitive, and it's just going to help you be a well-rounded individual. So thank you. Loved having you on here. And
Thanks.
we're the long story short, and I'm your chief of staff, and I'll see you with mine. Thanks again, and thanks, Bryan.
Yeah, of course.